breaking news for your home. Wayday! Wayfair's big sale is almost here, and you can score the best deals in home. Like up to 80% off everything home. Yes, you heard that right. 80% off with free shipping on everything. Plus surprise flash deals all Wayday long. We're talking outdoor furniture and essentials, rugs, and more. All at Wayfair, and all up to 80% off during Wayday. Shop Wayfair's Wayday from April 25th through 27th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
History as it happens. It's May 18th, 1860. On the third ballot at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president. The seventh point of the Republican Party platform declared that the new dogma that the Constitution of its own force carries slavery into any or all the territories of the United States is a dangerous political heresy, at variance with the explicit provisions of that instrument itself, with contemporaneous exposition and with legislative and judicial precedent, is revolutionary in its tendency and subversive of the peace and harmony of the country. The platform went on to declare that the normal condition of all the territory of the United States is that of freedom.
Hurrah for the choice of the nation, our chieftain so brave and so true. We'll go for the great Reformation, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky.
That November, just 6 years after his party was established, the former Whig Abraham Lincoln won a four-way race for the White House, America's first anti-slavery president. And after the Civil War, the party of Lincoln would become the party of U.S. Grant, and then Eisenhower, if we skip ahead to the 20th century, and then the party of Reagan, if we're to pass over a lot of Republican presidents between 1860 and today, when it is now the party of Donald Trump.
With the exception of the late, great Abraham Lincoln, I can be more presidential than any president that's ever held this office. That I can tell you.
Nobody has done more for the black community than Donald Trump. And if you look, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, possible exception, but the exception of Abraham Lincoln, nobody has done what I've done.
So last week, I produced an episode about the conservative movement at a crossroads because of this civil war between more traditional conservatives and libertarians on one side and the new right on the other, populists, post-liberal intellectuals, and more reactionary and racist elements, the so-called groypers who follow the white supremacist Nick Fuentes, who has a large online following of young men. In that podcast episode, the National Review's Dan McLaughlin argued the modern conservative movement were inheritors of Abraham Lincoln's legacy.
The Republican Party was founded as fundamentally a classically liberal party. Lincoln was probably the most purely classical liberal figure in the history of the American presidency. Those principles that go back to the Declaration and the Constitution, the American founding, they're part of our American patrimony. I think a big part of the whole National Review, Buckley, and then Reagan project was to fuse that with traditional conservatism and explain why the two fit together naturally.
Is the Republican Party today, at least the surviving Reaganite elements, is it still the party of Lincoln? We'll examine that question in this episode, the first of two exploring political lineages in America. With historian Jim Oakes, a premier scholar of antebellum politics and slavery, an expert on Abraham Lincoln, and the author of Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States. Our conversation next. But remember, you can support History as It Happens by subscribing. For ad-free listening, bonus content, and access to the entire catalog of 500 episodes. Tap subscribe now in the show notes, or go to historyasithappens.supercast.com. Jim Oakes, welcome back.
Good to be back, Martin, as always.
I can always find a reason to talk about the 19th century on this show. But before we get to that, as a historian, you're not very online, are you?
No.
Good for you. Good for you.
A friend of mine, I once had a conversation with Eric Foner about this. I said, I don't do any of that social media stuff. And he said, neither do I. We write books.
That's right. So I'm wondering then, because you're not online, how aware you are if you've been following this blow up on the right. You must be aware of it to some extent.
Yeah. I mean, I look at stuff, but I never put my own 2 cents in.
Yeah, so we have this infighting on the right between, I don't know, the more traditional Buckley conservatives and libertarians versus the so-called new right.
Right.
One of my recent episodes, you listened to it, Dan McLaughlin of the National Review is on. We were talking about the history of the conservative movement and what is going on with all the crazies today who've always been there. As a historian, is it possible to trace a lineage from, say, the establishment of a political party in 1856 to today's Republicans? Dan McLaughlin argued that the conservative movement of William F. Buckley and Ronald Reagan, they are inheritors of Abraham Lincoln.
Well, you go back that far, eventually everybody is descended from William the Conqueror. I suppose, a friend of mine he wrote a review a long time ago when I was in graduate school of Roots. Remember the Alex Haley book?
Yes.
He said it should have been called Root because back 6 generations, you have 126 people to choose from or something like that. And he choose one. Sure, you can draw, if you want to do a zigzag line back through a particular idea and get it back to the Republican Party in the 1850s. You could do that. But it's a tricky kind of thing. It's the kind of thing, actually, that intellectual historians repudiated a very long time ago, trying to trace an idea over time that way.
It's more of a political argument, too. I mean, the society is so much different now than it was then. But, the conservatives would argue their values, their principles are timeless. Rule of law. So, for instance, secession was illegal, just like an insurrection today would be illegal, unacceptable. Free markets, capitalism. Let's go to the history.
Right.
You're a historian. I had you on to talk history. Formation of the Republican Party. Like today, we see all these factions on the right. The Republican Party was a group of factions when it was formed, right? Or a group of factions came together to form it.
It was an unwieldy combination of radical abolitionists, conservative Whigs, angry Democrats about the expansion of slavery into the territories and things like that, anti-Southerners. The bulk of the party comes from where Lincoln came from, which is the Whig Party, because the Northern Whigs were always anti-slavery. They weren't an anti-slavery party, and anti-slavery wasn't something they put in any of their platforms. But if you look at the votes in Congress, the Whigs vote against the gag rule. They vote against the Mexican War. They vote against the fugitive slave law. And that's one of the reasons I think Lincoln is a little bit naive about the Whig Party, because all of his fellow Northern Whigs just take their anti-slavery convictions as a given. And he doesn't appreciate the degree to which they're dragged away from that by the Southern Whigs and other things like that. So they believe in a lot of different things. Yes. And because of that, because they are an unwieldy coalition from a lot of different sources, you can say a lot of different things about Republicans and find people who will justify that observation. You want to find a racist, you'll find racists, especially among the former Democrats, who want to keep slavery out of the territories because they want to keep Black people out of the territories, for example. That's not what the Whigs thought, but there's plenty of that in the Republican Party if you want to find it. There are free traders and there are tariff people.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about protectionism. That was definitely a Republican Party thing later on in the 19th century, early 20th century. I guess any new movement or any political movement, there could be infighting, there's factionalism, but they agree on who they are opposed to. In this case, it was the centrality of slavery. The centrality of slavery.
Yes, the common ground of all those different factions was a hostility to slavery, but more specifically, hostility to slavery's expansion in the territories, right? And as I say, some parts of that coalition were only concerned about the expansion of slavery in the territories, but the mainstream Republican Party that Lincoln comes into the party as part of was opposed to slavery as such, and had a lot of things that they thought the federal government could do to undermine slavery, and thought the government should actively engage in policies designed to, as Lincoln said, put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. He's not the only one who said that. Lots of people use that language about extinction, extinguishment, things like that. That was standard talk, and it was an activist kind of government.
Something that we've discussed in the past is this term abolitionism, that it's wrong just to consider William Garrison William Lloyd
Garrison.
Garrison. Yeah, I've only read a giant biography of the guy. William Garrison
Right.
as the model abolitionist. All
Right.
of these people could be considered abolitionists of a kind. Maybe they weren't immediatists, but the 1856 platform, for instance, the Republican Party, called for
Right.
Congress to abolish slavery in the territories. That's a pretty strong
Yes.
platform.
Yes. Yes. And their opposition, their two major sources of opposition to this are the Northern Democrats who think Congress should leave that issue alone and let the territorials legislatures decide for themselves. And the Southern pro-slavery politicians argued that Congress had absolutely no power to do that. So Lincoln's position and the Republican Party position is that the government does indeed have the power to go into a territory and say, you can't have slaves. Right. So it's not exactly a limited government argument. I mean, there are other aspects of the anti-slavery position that are states' rights oriented. When it came to fugitive slaves,
Personal liberty laws.
the mainstream position had always been it's up to the states. There's no enforcement clause in the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. It was deliberately taken out, and therefore it was left to the states. And it had long been an anti-slavery position that it was for the states to determine. So you get kind of states' rights backlashes in some northern states after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, based on the principle that, the federal government should not be doing this. This is a state thing.
So, as a historical matter, it probably is ridiculous to try to draw a line from Lincoln to, I don't know, McKinley or James Garfield. He's the subject of a new TV show. To
Right.
Calvin Coolidge, to Eisenhower, to Reagan, to, I'm not saying anyone does this, but you hear Party of Lincoln, Party of Eisenhower, Party of Reagan. Now we have, well, I don't know, the Party of Trump. These ideas are out there in this big blow up that's happening on the right. As I mentioned, I just spoke to National Review's Dan McLaughlin. Reaganism is still very important to him. Lincoln too, but there's still wisps of Reaganism floating in our atmosphere today. But let's go back to Lincoln. He was a Whig. What did he stand for?
Until 1854, for the first 20 years of his career, he's basically a standard Whig. And that means he thinks government should take a more active role in economic development. It should dredge rivers, it should build railroads, it should build schools, there should be universal public education. He was in favor of a much more, as the Whigs were, in favor of a national bank, tariffs, protective tariffs. So the Whigs were the party of active government when Lincoln entered politics and stayed that way.
What was Lincoln's relationship to capitalism?
I suppose until you get a socialist party in the early 20th century, there is no explicitly anti-capitalist parties anywhere. And there are certain elements in American political culture that could be called anti-capitalist, even if they're not talking about the overthrow of the system. I mean, people have made the case that the slaveholders are anti-capitalist because they're not the supporters of free labor, right? And if you define capitalism as free labor, or you think free labor is a kind of indispensable part of what capitalism is, then the slaveholders are anti-capitalist, and Lincoln is the arch capitalist by that standard.
Free soil, free labor, free men.
Yes. If you think capitalism is limited government, laissez-faire, Lincoln is not that. That's not his position.
The United States was founded on capitalism, free markets, private enterprise, self-improvement.
There are other things, though. The slavery debate injected an awful lot of principles we take to be fundamental into American political culture, and they're still there, right? Like in the 14th Amendment or in the 13th Amendment, the idea that slavery is a state institution until we get an amendment that abolishes slavery everywhere in the United States. That's an imposition. That's overriding what had traditionally been a state issue through a constitutional amendment. And then the 14th Amendment does the same thing. It says national citizenship is the primary form of citizenship, and every state is obliged to recognize the basic rights that come with being a U.S. citizen. And if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. And it empowers the federal government to go into states that are failing to protect the civil rights of people in ways that hadn't been the case before the Civil War. Same thing with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, it says, you
Empowers
cannot,
the federal government.
yeah, it tells the states they cannot discriminate in voting on the basis of race. That obviously has dramatic effects for the South, and that's one of the reasons there's a backlash in the South. But one of the things it also does that is not fully appreciated is that it abolishes all the racial discriminations against voting in the northern states, right? In New York, you had to have, if you were white and male, you could vote, an adult. If you were black, you had to have $250 worth of property. Right? Some states, it was just outright, you couldn't vote if you were black. Well, the 15th Amendment abolishes all of that stuff in the North. And after that, blacks could vote in the North, as well as the South. So it's a dramatic increase. The Civil War and the Civil War amendments, sometimes called the Reconstruction Amendments, represent a dramatic increase in the power of the federal government over the states.
So I'll ask another modern question about a mid-19th century figure. Was Lincoln a conservative?
In the sense that he was absolutely committed to the constitutional order and to rule of law? Sure, yes. It depends on what you think counts as conservative in the middle of the 19th century. If the issue of the day is slavery, which it was, let's say in 1860, and you drew a spectrum of American politics on the French model, left wing, right wing, right? The right wing would be composed of pro-slavery Southerners. The centrists would be the Upper South constitutional unionists and the Northern Democrats. And the left wing of the American political spectrum would be the Republicans. And Lincoln is smack dab in the middle of the left wing. Well, does that make him conservative? Compared to the radical Republicans, he's conservative.
Sure.
Compared to Jefferson Davis, he's a bloodthirsty Jacobin.
Modern labels don't really help us here. What can the second session of the 37th Congress teach us about the Party of Lincoln? I'm holding open the book, Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. I have your book over here too, Freedom National. The second session of the Congress, says McPherson, was one of the most productive in American history. Not only did the legislatures revolutionize the country's tax and monetary structures and take steps toward the abolition of slavery, they also enacted laws of far-reaching importance for the disposition of public lands, the future of higher education, and the building of transcontinental railroads. These achievements were all the more remarkable, he says, because they occurred in the midst of an all-consuming preoccupation with the war. So what is this legislative record of the Republicans? Because the Senate, or I should say the Democrats, had left the Senate and the House. They were vacant.
Right.
What does this tell us about, what they stood for in the context of our conversation here about political lineages?
Well, again, this is a party that is dominated by its Whig lineage, but it's also important to know that by the 1850s, the Northern Democrats had substantially abandoned a lot of the anti-statist stuff that they had inherited from the Jacksonian era. So one of the reasons the Northern Democrats get angry at Polk, it's a Northern Democrat that famously introduces the proviso, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, saying, no slavery in the territories we take from Mexico. But they're very annoyed at Polk for having vetoed a rivers and harbors bill that the Northern Democrats wanted to promote economic development. They wanted the federal government actively involved in those kinds of things. So they have substantially abandoned a lot of their earlier anti-government rhetoric as well. Not completely, not as much as the Republicans. But so that means that going into the Civil War, once the South is gone, the blockage that the Southern pro-slavery Southerners represented in Congress is gone. So they could do things they had wanted to do for a long time. So you get a Homestead Act, right, which opens up the Western territories to settlement, rationalizes the settlement in ways that it wouldn't have been otherwise. You get a transcontinental railroad. I mean, we all know that where are they going to put a railroad is a big source of controversy in the 1850s. Jefferson Davis wants, and the pro-slavery Southerners want a southern route to the Pacific, and Stephen Douglas wants it to come from Chicago. They finally get a Pacific Railroad Act through. They get a Department of Agriculture, which I think if you know the history of what the Department of Agriculture does in the late 19th century, and very few people know it, it's an enormously powerful bureaucracy. They are empowered and successfully manage to order, for example, if a disease outbreak happens among cattle, They order the slaughter of tens of thousands of animals. It's an incredibly powerful bureaucracy that's created during the Civil War. You get the first national banking system effectively since it's the second bank, and you basically make the dollar, the federal dollar, a legal tender, and every other currency that's been floating around is disadvantaged by that. They set up the land grant college system, which produces University of California, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, these great universities that come out of this land grant college system that they create. That too had been a source of controversy. The idea that the federal government should be in any way involved in creating universities is like that's new.
I'm not sure Ronald
And
Reagan
so
would have approved of that.
it's not a limited government position in the way that some of the famous quote from Reagan, government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem. You wouldn't really hear Republicans talking that way.
So after the Civil War, you already mentioned this, Jim, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, those are driven by the Republicans. Not every Republican was a champion of civil rights, but by and large, the party was the party of civil rights during Reconstruction.
Yes.
U.S. Grant as well, trying to protect black freedom in the South. The Republicans were the party committed to upholding black freedom. You hear this a lot today. I don't want to say a lot, and I'm not sure by whom, but I'll just say some people on the right will say the Democrats were the party of Jim Crow. They were the party of segregation. They're the ones whose arms had to be twisted to break the filibuster in the 1960s to get all. But that ignores the party realignment that took place in the past half century or more. I don't know what you make of all of that, but we could talk about how the Republicans were a big civil rights party after the Civil War.
Tarring Democrats with the long history of racism into the present is as simplistic as trying to find a direct lineage from Lincoln to Reagan. I have been on panels with historians who have explicitly said that in the 19th century, the Republicans were the party of civil rights and the Democrats were the racists. Today, it's the opposite. And
But historians have said that.
I've heard historians say that.
So I don't feel bad about asking my question now. This stuff is out there.
But when you look at somebody like, I suppose he's cranky, but Dinesh D'Souza made this argument a long time ago, right? The Democrats, the Republicans now are the party of equal justice under law. Justice is blind, no race-based distinctions in law. And the Democrats are the ones who keep upholding race as the criteria for whatever. Affirmative action, civil rights, voting rights, things like that. It's the Democrats who are obsessed with race and the Republicans who are arguing against those kinds of racial analysis. There's a splinter of truth to that, but it only goes to show why trying to draw direct lineages from one era to another is tricky.
What is our most important inheritance of Lincoln's legacy today?
Obviously, the abolition of slavery is a Republican party. Yes. That's gigantic. Yes. It's the most important social revolution in American history. And it was purely a Republican Party project from start to finish. It's the raison d'etre of the Republican Party is getting slavery put away. Nothing in American history makes sense without that, since the Civil War, without that. But they're also the party that they were the party of civil rights, of equal rights. And I think it has enormous practical consequences, but it's a more abstract proposition that the Republicans, it's in that 1856 platform that you mentioned, saying that the Declaration of Independence is the picture and the Constitution is the frame. The idea that the principle of fundamental human equality, that all men and women, blacks and whites, are all equally entitled to the natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That gets firmly implanted dead center of American political culture in a way that is profoundly significant, profoundly significant. We're living with that. But there are other things too, to make the anti-slavery argument stick, you had to be able to say slaves are not a constitutionally protected species of property, that the slaves were made property by Southern law and Southern law only, and there is no extraterritorial reach of that law beyond the state that creates that, because slavery is a violation of natural rights, of natural law. So the ability to say that some things are not legitimately commodities, beginning with human beings, is also an important part of what we consider essential to American political culture. And it can be trivial. It can be Christmas is too commercialized, but it can also be healthcare is a right, not a commodity. The idea that some things should not be commodified is also there.
We should never, ever, ever, ever understate or overlook the enduring importance of the abolition of slavery, an event of world historical importance. But post-2020 and George Floyd, I'll just share this anecdote, and also because of the way Reconstruction ended or was destroyed. What I'm trying to get at here is, in 2020, George Floyd, I would see memes online. Abraham Lincoln never really abolished slavery. The 13th Amendment allows for that loophole for the prison system, right? So we still have slavery today. People are still, though, drawing that straight line of white supremacy all through American history.
The meme was nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed. And it's funny because it is people more on the right who challenged that idea. It was people on the left, and
Yes.
maybe in your profession, who went along with that crazy stuff.
Yes, that's correct. I think that became a standard liberal trope. I'm on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I used to hear it all the time. New York liberals talk that way all the time. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. You had an incident of, a racist cop kills an African-American and nothing's changed. You see, nothing's changed. I have heard tenured professors, African-American professors at the University of Chicago say, we were never emancipated. Do you know what slavery was? Do you know what it means to have been a slave, to have, it's illegal to teach you to read, your marriages aren't legal, you can be bought and sold. It's like a failure of imagination. And it's like, if you say things are different, it means they're wonderful. That's not what anybody is saying. That's not what anybody is saying.
Our discourse these days is terrible. You and I usually don't discuss current politics here, but this does have a historical edge to it. I think it's a shame when people on the left, Democrats, disown Lincoln without having to say, I'm disowning Lincoln. When they make comments like that, you're disowning Lincoln.
They were disowning themselves, too. That's the thing about it. It's like there's some kind of arrogance involved in thinking that you are the first person in the history of the United States to really believe in racial equality. Like, you have no lineage, you have no ancestry. Like, why would you give that up? If you're a liberal, why would you say all of American history belongs to the conservatives? It's always been much more successful to claim that, to do what Martin Luther King did. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? You invoke that.
He had the promissory note from Thomas Jefferson.
You invoke it. You don't repudiate it.
When you were getting into the history profession, and this will get us into a conversation for a bit about the modern conservative movement, William F. Buckley, backlash to the New Deal, hostility to the civil rights movement, at least for a time, 1950s, 1960s. When you were getting into the history profession, conservatives weren't really happy with Lincoln, or at least there was a grouping of people who thought Lincoln was a tyrant, not on board with efforts to desegregate the South.
Right. That was a strand of republicanism, but there's this great book by this Straussian at Claremont, Harry Jaffa, called A Crisis of the House Divided. And that was like one of the first major books on Lincoln that I ever read. And he is pro-Lincoln, and he represented a very powerful pro-Lincoln strand in American conservatism that's still there.
I think he influenced Buckley at a time when the National Review was not printing pro-Lincoln stuff.
Right.
If you want to make a dichotomy, you had people who were maybe pro-Calhoun, and then some who were pro-Lincoln.
Right. The Calhoun stuff.
Antipathy to civil rights, defending states' rights to keep segregated societies. So I don't see that much on the right anymore, maybe on the lunatic fringes, but...
That's why I say, in my experience since I started writing about Lincoln, conservatives have been much more receptive to what I have to say, at least among historians. Not all historians, but law professors are much more open to disagreeing. There's a much wider spectrum of thought in legal scholarship than there is in mainstream U.S. historical scholarship, I think. And so
I guess it depends on the issue. There's race. There's also the issue of Lincoln's war powers, where he was taking extraordinary measures. We discussed habeas corpus on the show, things like that.
Well, for any constitutional scholar, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are profoundly significant. Profoundly significant. They changed the Constitution in some very, very fundamental ways. And the Supreme Court didn't always uphold the true significance of those amendments, but they didn't go away. As I said about invoking the Declaration of Independence, you invoke that legacy of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and It's a liberationist invocation. It's about equality and it's about freedom. It's about federal protection of freedom.
Is the Republican Party today still the party of Lincoln?
There is a part of that legacy. They're coming off out of a political culture in which, especially in the North, the Republicans are a Northern party, and their opponents in the North are the Democrats, and the Democrats are viciously demagogically racist, right? So they get to the Reconstruction, and they want to protect the freed people, right? So they pass these laws in contrast to what the Democrats would say, like the Southern Homestead Act, designed to get freed people land. It says explicitly that the distribution of this land cannot be based on race. They're erasing race as a criterion because they're coming out of a political culture in which that kind of thinking is what their opponents are all about. So there is a sense in which certain strands of the modern Republican Party, not anymore, and now under Trump it's changed, the McLaughlin strand, that says,
Sure.
that's important. True equality, true racial equality depends on the government not allowing race to be a criteria for the distribution of land, homesteads, for example, things like voting, eliminating racial qualifications. So the hostility to affirmative action or DEI and stuff like that. Some of that is racist, but some of that is a legacy of that strand of the Republican Party.
Yeah, principled opposition to those things. I don't think there's really any way to defend Barry Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Act, but
No.
he did say he made a mistake. He admitted he made a mistake, but he would have put himself in the principled aisle rather than the George Wallace aisle. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 136 Republicans in the House supported it, 27 Republicans in the Senate. Our friend Sean Wilentz wrote a book, The Age of Reagan, pages 180 to 187, details the Reagan administration's hostility to the civil rights advances. I mean, today's Republican Party, the party of Trump, is not Lincoln's party. It is not Ronald Reagan's party anymore.
I don't know what to make of the current Republican Party. I mean, there was a way in which Reagan is certainly a turning point in modern American conservatism. It's a much more aggressive repudiation of the New Deal. Anti-New Dealism is a strand that goes back to the New Deal, right? 1934, the Republicans run against the New Deal, and they've been running against the New Deal ever since. I do think hostility to regulation, it's not like, let's say, the Zoran Mamdani saying we need less regulation, the bureaucracy is too heavy-handed and things like that. That's a statist saying we need the state, but the state has to be flexible and it has to be right. Whereas there's a kind of root and branch hostility to regulation that's part of conservatism that is different to the very idea of regulation. Imagine the settlement of the West without a homestead law that basically graphs out the entire West. You look at a map of any Midwestern state and there's squares, right? And there's squares within squares within squares because the federal government has laid out these patches for purchase, right? It's hard to imagine the settlement of the West without that, and it's hard to imagine the settlement of the West without the U.S. Army, right?
Yes, that's true.
So it's inconceivable that could have happened. And then you get Pacific Railroad Acts and you get all sorts of government involvement. Not like now. It's not as big and bureaucratic, but it's there. It's there as a strand, and it's hard to imagine American history without that kind of stuff. And like I said, we underappreciate what the regulatory apparatus that got set up with the establishment of the Department of Agriculture. It is enormously significant. It's enormously for scientific and research purposes in the banking regulations.
You can't understand American history without understanding the government's indispensable role in so many of these things. So
you're a settler and you go out and you claim a homestead. What's the first thing you do when you claim your homestead? You go to the office of the government and you ask for a deed, right? And the government issues the deed. One of the famous reasons that Abraham Lincoln's father left Kentucky is because it wasn't gridded out. It wasn't part of the Northwest Ordinance. So land titles were unclear because everybody was settling on top of everybody else. You had to go north to get a clear sense of what the boundaries of your share were, because the government did that.
You know,
The
my
government
next
did that.
episode, I'll be speaking to Max Boot about the party of Reagan, Reaganism. The way some people today mythologize Reagan and what they remember about him doesn't actually match the record. You know, the Reagan Revolution actually failed in many respects. Just to name one, the federal budget got a lot bigger during it.
I remember California first started beefing up the auto emissions regulations because it was so big it could do its own, and Reagan tried to overrule it. States' rights? I don't think so. The states' rights, when you want states' rights, you're for states' rights, and when you don't want states' rights, you're not for states' rights. Is the Republican Party opposed to the military-industrial complex?
No.
That's as big government gets.
Yes.
We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is time to check and reverse the growth of government, which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed. It is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll continue with the theme of political lineages. Max Boot will be our guest, and we will discuss the Party of Reagan. Go to historyasithappens.supercast.com to subscribe. And don't forget my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.